Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Bennett Tyler with Aberdeen, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Accounts Payable, Automation, Efficiency in the Emergence of RPA. The webinar today is hosted by Aberdeen and sponsored by Kofax. During this webinar, we will be diving into how top-performing companies use emerging technologies like robotic process automation to drive accounts payable performance. Along the way, we'll also reveal the many benefits they enjoy as a result. Our presenters today are Brian Ball, VP and Group Director of the Supply Chain and GSM Practice here at Aberdeen, and Art Sarno, Product Marketing Director at Kofax. If you'd like to read their full bios, you can use the drop-down arrows below their photos on the right side of your screen. I encourage you all to submit your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A field at the top left of your screen. We will facilitate a Q&A at the end of the presentation to try to address as many of your questions as possible. Also on the left of your screen, you will see our resource section, where you'll find a copy of today's presentation deck, as well as some additional reading on today's topic. It is now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Brian Ball.
Thank you, Bennett. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you joining our webinar today. Let me take you through briefly the agenda, the flow of information. You've seen the introductions. I'm going to be taking you through the Aberdeen methodology very briefly so you'll understand where the data came from, and then the research findings, and you'll see a mix of my research findings and also how it meshes with the things that Kofax is trying to do, and Art will certainly take you through that. We'll get to the end and do a little summary and some key takeaways for you and recommendations, and then we'll move to the Q&A, and we'll try and cover that, anything that you bring up in there, and do the best we can to answer your questions. Let me get started briefly with the Aberdeen methodology. Excuse me. The way Aberdeen approaches our research, we get hard research, hard surveys from our end user community, and based on business metrics, we classify those respondents into best-in-class, industry average, and laggards, and you'll see, and that's based on the business metrics. So performance, we take the 3 or 4 metrics that we use to categorize them. Whoever performs best, by definition, the top 20% are then the best in class. So that's basically how we group the data. Then we slice that information using best in class versus the competition, and we address the questions of what business pressures are companies under, what we call the PACE methodology, P being for pressures that companies are under, A being the actions, strategic actions that they're taking to respond to those pressures, offset them, mitigate them, however you want to look at it. So those are the activities that they're pursuing right now. The capabilities, the C, are the things that they already have in place to make those actions come alive, meaning where do they perform better? What are they doing differently than the competition that allows them, 1, to have better performance, and 2, to take on those actions and do a better job on that, versus their competitors. And then the technologies behind that, the technology enablers, that's the E. And that's basically what's behind the capabilities. And you'll see that data come alive as we walk through, and typically where you're going to see the differences are going to be in the capabilities and technology enablers where best-in-class companies have invested, in their technology, and that's why they're ahead. So let's get started. Accounts payable, automation, efficiency, and the emergence of RPA. First of all, just sort of a beginning point. If there's any doubt in your mind, the age of digital transformation isn't coming, it's here. And you only have to look around to sort of figure that out. Not that most folks on the phone haven't already done that, but just if there's any question, it's not really a question at all anymore. When you're talking about businesses that are actually shipping, in the same day that they get the order, you can't do that, with a bunch of manual processes unless it's perhaps one out of many. To be able to do that on a routine basis, you've got to be, out of manual processes and into automation. The issue is trying to manage a growing volume of transactions. As businesses scale, the number of transactions increase. As supply chains expand, the number of data points that they receive either from their customers and or their supply network. It used to be maybe one level of suppliers. Now you're looking at 2, 3, 4, and even the long tail suppliers in other countries, plus all the in-transit information associated with that. So just the volume of transactions alone businesses are facing is really growing, and you've heard the term big data. Here's where it applies. The point is that speed of business is increasing. Again, when you've got to respond to requests from customers for same day, next day kind of performance, the traditional channels of distribution have changed. The end user customers dictating a lot of different things. They want it anytime, anywhere, and in many forms. So all businesses are responding. There's a trickle-down effect there, but the pace and speed of business is increasing, and you don't have to look too far. If you go back, in the I'd say 80s and 90s, people gauged their inventories in terms of month supply. In the 90s and early 2000s, it was week supply, day supply now, and even percentage of days, if you will. So automation is now the table stakes to remain competitive. If you are not automating, you're going to find yourself left behind. And as we walk through the data, you're going to see that and to a great degree. And then the question really for the audience is ask yourself as you follow along, are you ready for the future? Do you have things in place? How do you stack up with what the best-in-class companies are doing? Briefly, we're going to look at the business pressures. These are the things that are driving behavior for all companies, sort of in terms of priority, in terms of the way they're ranked. Difficulty in managing, paper-based documents. Anybody that's got paper is frustrated with it. What can I do to eliminate that? The labor cost to actually manage all that is very high. It's low value added, but it's got to be done. So, again, a driver behind automation. The challenges of processing high volumes at current staff levels, it's a challenge. In other words, how do you scale? Adding people as those transactions is really just another cost. So what can you do to offset that? And then lack of visibility into the order to cash and procure to pay cycles. Anybody that's trying to manage their cash flow, if it's on paper, you can't see it. And particularly if you're really very tight on cash, or you're trying to respond quickly, you need to make decisions, and it could be in terms of adding capital, adding people, making a decision about expenses. If you can't see exactly where you are, then you're behind the eight ball. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Art for a minute, and he's going to take you through how these things apply and what we're looking at in terms of the scope of the process. Art, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brian. The business pressures that you addressed impact the entire supply chain. What I'm showing here is the scope of the kinds of automation that we focus on at Kofax, and today we're going to be focused on the procure-to-pay process, and within that, the invoice automation process. The processes all have a lot in common. The internal management of them, the primary system of record for these processes is the ERP, but the challenges for most of our customers is that the information flowing in and out of the ERP requires significant manual effort at some points. It takes too long to complete the process. The information is not always visible or complete in order to execute on a decision. So they do require a lot of supporting documentation, capture, management, storage. They suffer from inefficient workflow processes, some of them. They need flexible, visible solutions. And as surprising as it sounds, a lot of these steps tend to be manual. And, of course, these resources could be aligned to more valuable tasks. And then lastly, of course, it's hard to connect all this information together. So I put this chart up so that as we talk about these processes, you can kind of map your own process over them. And for the areas that are not covered, we're going to be talking a little later about where RPA can fill some of the gaps that exist in these processes, whether they're automated or not. So today we're going to start with the invoicing process. And we've focused on this because it's probably the most intense area in terms of transactions and activity for control, and also one of the most costly because of the transactions coming in, the mix of them, the languages associated with them, being able to take the invoice, classify it, and then transact it, and finally integrate it into an approval workflow, and at the end actually post it for processing. So this invoice processing flow can be expanded to show the end-to-end AP automation scope, and our definition of that is end-to-end from multi-channel capture all the way through the matching of the invoice, the coding of the invoice for the non-PO invoices, the approval workflow, and then finally when the transaction is perfected, posting that transaction for payment in the ERP. And then the supporting systems that we have, supplier master data for supplier portal, extensive end-to-end analytics so that we can look at quality of service, productivity, cash management, and of course the ability to archive the data into an enterprise content system of your choice. And that again depends on the configuration that you might be working with. So as we define it, we talk about the goal of end-to-end automation for AP is to streamline the business processes, and the result of that, of course, we hope is a dramatic reduction of invoice cost, optimized cash management, improved cycle times, better supplier interactions, more visibility, and through the analytics, more insight for strengthening these internal controls, and of course, always worried about being compliant. Here's an overview of the AP automation cycle, and you're probably very familiar with it, but you can see that it usually consists of 4 or 5 major steps: the capture, regardless of whether it's coming through a vendor portal or through the mailroom, and then finally the extraction of the information, the classification of the information, the verification of the information, with the goal to reduce errors and hopefully to attain straight-through processing. We think that a good number for most of our customers that have been automating for a while is in the 70-80% range for straight-through processing. And then finally getting into the AP workflow where we're doing the approvals, the escalations, the exception processing, and also for the non-PO invoices, the GL coding. And then finally, once the approval process has been executed, posting the transaction for payment into the ERP. Now, there are 2 types of these integrations that we find, and we offer both depending on the ERP. We call one an outside-in implementation, where all of the processing is processed outside the ERP. Of course, the ERP data is used for validation, obviously the vendor data, the purchase data, that kind of thing. But in general, the ERP is extremely handled outside, using external interfaces and all of that, and then finally introduced into the ERP at the end of the process. On the other hand, for ERPs such as SAP, ECC, or S4HANA, or Oracle EBS, our customers demand what we would call an inside-out integration, where the transaction is tightly coupled to the ERP. So in effect, in the SAP implementation, the application is effectively in an SAP landscape. The user is operating as if they're in an SAP transaction. Of course, we make it a lot easier. Don't have to memorize all those codes. By the way, there's over 200,000 of them in the entire SAP application. And we try to make that a lot easier. And finally, a number of interface styles can be used as well, including the traditional SAP interface, or the web application, or even the new Fiori, or mobile, of course. So there are different styles of these implementations that we find. So in general, if you're taking a look at an overall architecture, there's basically 5 major components. The multi-channel capture, and there are a variety of capture technologies that can be integrated with these solutions. These best practice workflows, one of the key attributes of a workflow, we feel, is the ability to modify it without having impact through maintenance. So in effect, if you have a basic workflow for approval and it has to be extended, that extension is a user-defined extension, and that extension is isolated and not deprecated when you do an upgrade to the system. And this is an architectural implementation that needs to be considered. And then, of course, the ERP integration, whether it's tightly coupled or loosely coupled, depending on the style of implementation and the ERP that you're dealing with. multiple ERPs, in many cases through acquisition. We find that the users would like to abstract their workflows and have them operate over multiple ERPs and consolidate their capture. Perhaps have one broker capture product and then distribute that out and finally consolidate into a larger ERP. So for example, you'll find a lot of EBS now with Oracle Financials in the cloud running in some of the subsidiaries, driving the data back in. And conversely with SAP, you'll see a lot of people using S4HANA for financial reporting, but they're remaining on ECC. So we see a lot of hybrids out there as well. And then the other implementation, of course, is to be able to have integration with a portal, whether it's self-service, whether you're using a portal that's provided by the vendor, or you're using a business network portal like Ariba or Talia. That should be considered. And then, of course, the analytics, which allow you to have the visibility and insight through the entire transaction. And then all of that is supported by, obviously, search and content management and integration opportunities to be able to integrate with, say, external portals. This is a great area for RPA to be able to get to a portal that has really not well-defined interfaces. And finally, the process management, the workflows that can be extended to accommodate new processes as they evolve. All right, Brian, handing it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Art. Appreciate that. So let's take a minute and back to a bit of the understanding of what do we mean by performance and how do you measure that? What are some things that affect the process itself? So when we look at best-in-class companies, we've got, defining the leaders really is, here are some of the metrics that you would use to say this is what better companies are doing. First of all, is just, the days payable outstanding. The more efficient you are, the more timely you are. Best in class are 18% less, 13.8 versus 16.8 days. But, that's a significant amount of time that you're able to get things done compared to the competition. And then if you look at the amount of invoices, this is per employee equivalent. Anyway, it's 29%, versus 17%. That's a 70% improvement, after implementation of automation. I mean, that's a big difference. That's a huge, huge win when you start to think about, do I need to add people instead of that? But this is the difference you get, using automation. And so that's a pretty big number when you think about it in that context. On-time payment, 91 versus 80, that's, a 14% improvement. Where, it helps in terms of leverage with suppliers. When you can pay them on time, you're able to go to them versus the old adage of writing your suppliers. Suppliers are they have to deal with that. But if they get paid on time, they're much more willing to cooperate. Trust me, having been in purchasing for several years, that makes a big difference when you have to go, look for some favors, if you will. Early payment discount opportunities. This is another one. This translates directly into savings. 25% increase, with automation versus without, in terms of discounts you're able to take that you just couldn't get to because of manual processes. And then processing time, 5.3 days versus 9.3 days. Just the time it takes, it tells you that, it's 43% less in time, but think of that in terms of people. Think of that in terms of, the amount of time your employees are tied up where they could be doing something different. So this just gives you an idea in terms of how do you measure performance in this area. And these are some examples. There's a lot more. Straight through processing time is one that Art mentioned, and we even have data around that too. But significant numbers, once automation is in place, are prevalent. So let's talk about, what are the best-in-class companies doing differently? How do they get to those numbers? It's easy to talk about. So this is where we now divide the data, and we look at the best-in-class versus all others. We've lumped the industry average and laggards together into all others. They're usually pretty close. But first of all, let's talk about electronic approval workflow. This is, again, 2.2, 2.3 times greater This isn't trivial. This isn't slightly more. This is 2.3 times, more likely that you're going to have it in best-in-class companies versus not. Again, this is why their performance is so much better. A centralized repository for invoices across the organization. Again, this is 67% more likely. Big difference here. Can I access it? Can everybody see it? The ability to take advantage of that. Then you look at data extraction. This is from the printed document, this is the automation part. This is where you convert it to paper into a digital record. Again, 2.8 times greater. Significant numbers. Data extraction, automated remittance of payments, more than twice. Again, huge savings in terms of time. And if you look at these, just look at the dark blue bars versus the light blue bars. There's a significant gap between them. And then you get to, if you will, dashboards and being able to see the information in a form that's helpful. Think in terms of cash flow. This is 3x. This is 3 times, more likely. So these are the things, capabilities in place that best-in-class companies have compared to all others. And again, these are the reasons, why they perform better. Now we're going to take a look at, some of the, I entitled this, future is now, but it's the technology behind some of this that makes a big difference. Spend analytics, again, 2.7 times greater. Software configured to capture and interpret payment processing. That's another 2.7 times greater. And these are big numbers. In other words, this tells you they've invested in the technology that allows them to do these things, which creates those capabilities we just discussed, okay? Then we look at the performance by bots, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second, and Art's going to take you through a little deeper dive on that. But again, this is using bots in the process, within automation, within AP. And again, this is 3x for the best in class compared to the other guys. So it says these are the things that say pay attention. This is where the differences are. And there's the emergence of blockchain. That's coming. It's not there 100%, but people are starting to dabble in it. The best in class have a lead. No surprise on emerging technologies that they would take the lead. But this is where the differences are in terms of where people have invested and why their capabilities are so much greater. Let's talk just a second about where you would use, RPA, robotic process automation, common and complementary uses, very direct. Common uses in finance and accounting. If you guys don't have it, these are the places you're going to find it. Probably the most applicable up front. Inbound and outbound invoicing, literally the transaction side, the order processing side, and the financial close side. And then complementary uses, and we've seen this certainly on the supply chain, quoting and things like configure price quote, invoicing, this is the automated invoicing type of approach, and then change order management. Those would be sort of the secondary uses, but certainly important ones where they could be manually intensive. And so, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Art, and he's going to dive a little deeper on that and get into some of the robotic processing. So, go ahead, Art.
All right, so we have to start with a definition, but I think one of the things that we should clear up is the difference between business process management and RPA. And of course, there are many, many issues around that in terms of interpretation. But in the BPM parlance, if you're looking at a system like Pegasystems or one of the large BPM vendors, that we're talking about a major infrastructure that is implemented with very intense kinds of learning curves and all of that. And of course, RPA is exactly the opposite. RPA is the ability to fill gaps with very small transactional type activities that can be coupled together to address gaps in processes. And to go down the list on the left, what we talk about is a software robot. And of course, it provides a virtualized full-time equivalent or a virtual workflows. They're 24/7, they don't sleep. And they can manipulate and operate and orchestrate software. They follow some rules. They're basically, in most cases, following a manual, repetitive process that has some rules associated with it. And they are able to be deployed either, through a schedule or as a virtual assistant that's on all time, interacting with events. So the software robot effectively is mimicking human transactions. It can be taught to drive applications the same way people do through the interface. It can be trained to complete tasks, and by training I mean to be provided with rules or algorithms that would drive it. It can be used to orchestrate third-party systems. So, for example, if you're vetting a supplier and you need to go out and look at 4 or 5 sources, for example, their TIN number, their credit score, that kind of thing, the system can be implemented for that. They should be able to be deployed either on-premise or as a hybrid or hosted, public or private cloud. And of course, some of the capabilities that we're looking at is the ability to scale the workforce. You can take FTEs that are assigned to these tasks and reassign them to more productive strategic tasks. We're starting to see the introduction of machine learning. Of course, a lot of the processes that RPA vendors are talking about now, we've had in Kofax for many, many years. The ability to learn through a transaction, for example, a document template-free as invoices are coming through, this learning environment has been with the product forever. And of course, workflows to do AP matching and approval are also sometimes labeled as RPA, but these are just standard AP automation workflows. So the most critical point here is to be able to assess the automation process and then outside of that find gaps that are complementary. For example, we would not recommend using RPA in the place of a full-blown multi-channel capture solution. These are very mature products. They have a massive amount of capability and history, and for us, it's something that we provide as part of our solution. There are other areas we'll look at where we can fill the gaps. And in terms of the stages of evolution, a lot of it is down at the stage 1 level now. That's where the labor is. That's where the manual intensity is. That's where the transactions are. It's starting to move up towards rule-based processing to handle exceptions. A lot of that is happening now. And then finally, through orchestration, we're going to start to see the cognitive computing. And in many cases, these are assistants to humans. In some cases, at the clerical level, they tend to be actual replacements at that level. So we're seeing a whole evolution of these processes. So what are the typical activities we see down at the level 1 of the stage 1 automation, even some of the stage 2? We can categorize these robots, so this RPA activity, into data entry. So a traditional data entry robot, we'll show you an example of that later, is going to automate a process, for example, logging into a system, making sure the login is viable, handling all the security issues with the protocol, and then finally performing some task, such as posting a transaction to a form in the environment. And if this is a repetitive task that's happening over and over, that can be clearly automated. So this is a process discovery issue that we find when we analyze the process. Then we have those that do validation and verification. Onboarding is a good example where you're looking to onboard a customer or a supplier, and you are going out to access multiple data sources. Some may have well-defined interfaces, some may not, and you want to be able to vet the customer or the supplier before you do the onboarding. It's another application. Then you have the classic systems integration robots where if the applications do not have well-defined ERP or API type interfaces, then the robot can do that. So for example, one of the early uses of our solution, which is called KAPOW, K-A-P-O-W, for RPA, was the ability to implement what we call a synthetic API, which had the ability to go to a website that did not have a well-defined interface and basically parse through the HTML supporting script, not looking for coordinates on the screen, which can change, but looking at the actual HTML script or the cascading style sheet texture, and then extracting information at that level. So there are many, many banks and institutions that are integrating with portals where they might still be old. They might use the old jalopy interfaces, and they do not have very well-defined interfaces where this kind of technology can be used. And then finally, you have an event-based robot that can be executed based on a sequence or some activity taking place based on time, based on some transaction invoking this. So those are kind of the ones that we're seeing that are very popular at the level 1, 2 stage. So one of the things we like to do is encourage a customer to take a look at the cycle, in this case the procure to pay, and then just highlight out areas where RPA could be a candidate, and then finally net out from that where your current P2P applications are covering those spaces. So for example, in this one you may have a sales order process that requires access to a catalog, and this catalog may or may not be accessible through standard traditional, or you might want to compare multiple catalogs to get a price optimization. This is a potential RPA type application. Another one might be in the onboarding of a supplier, where you're going to be validating certain behavior or characteristics in the past. Have they had good credit scores? Are they viable in terms of their threat level, in terms of the location they're in? Are they viable in terms of their credit rating? That kind of thing. And then, of course, all through this, any of these transactions that are being handled can be posted in an automated fashion, especially if it's repetitive. Now, if you drill down into the AP automation process, you see, again, a number of areas. Now, some of those are just basics that we have covered many, many years in our AP automation solution. So the capture, the data entry, the classification, the extraction, the perfecting of the invoice, this is all done by the solution. The ERP matching, the two-way, the three-way, the four-way, the N-way matching, the GL coding, the approval, all of that is done by the automation process. So you take a look at this and start to isolate some of the gaps that might exist. Again, the supplier onboarding one is a good one that could exist. You may not have delivery notes implemented as an automated system where you want to look at the delivery matched with your two-way match that could be automated. If the vendor doesn't provide that for you, you can use RPA to go out and grab the delivery note, look at the expected delivery time, and reconcile that into the end of the process. So there are a lot of areas here, and I just try to highlight a few that you might consider in some of your own processes. So here's an example of a robot being implemented, and we have an SAP transaction on the right side of the screen. And on the top of the screen, we actually have the process flow. And again, this is implemented by a business user. There's no coding. These are widgets. A widget might be, log on, check for validation, handle error, and it's implemented as a process flow in the design studio. And we're showing this. Of course, the user wouldn't see this normally. And then on the bottom left, we have an Excel spreadsheet that has some transactions. And these transactions are now going to be posted to this desktop interface, this form that comes up. And it's very repetitive. This could be part of a financial close. This could be a general ledger master data update transaction that was happening, any of these activities. The automation system does not handle this natively. Typically in financial close, we might see hundreds of spreadsheets needing to be consolidated and extracted in order to drive the month or quarter or year-end financial close. So I think that this gives you a good idea of this. We actually have a demo where this can be shown live and take you through the entire process, and we just don't have enough time to drill down into it. But you can see the kind of the structure there where you have the robot process flow. And by the way, these robots can be joined together, so they can be assembled as assemblies, or they can be managed as separate entities. And of course, one attribute that the system needs to have is the ability to not only develop, but to deploy, to manage, to maintain, and to measure the transaction as it's happening. All right, Brian, so let's talk about automation versus no automation.
Thanks, Art. As you saw in our earlier data, we looked at best-in-class companies compared to their competition. In other words, based on performance, here's what the best-in-class companies are doing. But we thought it would be very interesting just to see. Let's just take a look, of automation versus no automation and see what that means to companies. So we start, with the very first slide, and we look at a process, the financial close process, which certainly involves a tremendous amount of AP automation as well as automation elsewhere. But no automation takes 8 days. With automation, it's 3 days. So it's almost threefold in terms of, what it does to you. Who wouldn't like to be able to close in 3 days? Clearly those without it, they're getting hammered to hurry up and get things done. And there's constant pressure there, which also adds to mistakes when people are, under pressure. But being able to do that in 3 days and produce the results is pretty impressive. Now we looked at, one of the fundamentals that you're going to engage in during the close process, expedited journal entries, if you will. Reconciliation between incoming payments and outstanding outlays. This is where you're really looking at what could happen in terms of sitting out there and making sure you've got those things reconciled. Again, it's 46%, better for those with automation than those without. Looking at, process policy triggers, exceptions to the policy that happen automatically. Again, a significant gap between those with automation without. 62% greater, that you're going to have that if you've got automation. Automated transaction posting to a general ledger. Again, another pretty significant gap, 48% to 34%. And then, automated closure of internal receivables and accounts. And, again, this is 2X. So just in terms of basic processes that you're going to walk through, on the journal entry and reconciliations, these are pretty fundamental things that everybody goes through. And you can see that there's a significant advantage just to have automation in place. Now let's look at the checklist items that you might walk through. Again, the ability to perform what-if scenarios, a much bigger differential, 43%, greater likelihood that you can take that on. The continued, policy and compliance monitoring, again, have that in place. 41% greater likelihood. The ability to support workflow, access across multiple locations. Any larger company at all where you've got more than one site, just think about the ability to look at across those sites, and have that, workflow capability where you might even be spanning, multiple ERPs as an example. Big differential here, 58% more likely. So again, just another standard part of the financial close is, the checklist that you've got to execute on, and again, big differences here. So now I want to take you through one more, and that's, the running of reports. Everybody's been pressured before to, let's get to the answer, let's get to the information. Automated delivery of aging reports, again, this is not trivial. This is almost 3X, not quite, but close to, 49% greater to get enterprise-wide collaboration and data sharing, geographies, departments. This is where you literally need to pull everybody together, get domain, reporting, if you will. Then the ability to perform, multidimensional, look at the data several different ways. Could be by geo, could be by business unit, whatever the case might be. Not trying to dictate that, but be able to create those different cuts. Again, it's not quite double, but order of magnitude 86% larger. And then just, automated financial reporting, disclosure management, actually being able to create the narrative as a first pass in terms of what you would, submit as a report. That stuff's automated now. 5X for those that are automated versus those that aren't. And, this takes a lot of time. At least you're getting a summary version of it. This is what lets you get there in 3 days versus, taking 8 days, being able to get to the answers, produce the results, define the results, report on the results, comment on the results. That's where all this applies. So, again, this is automation versus no automation, and it just shows you the stark differences. So the question really is, can you afford not to do this? And I think that's what, if you don't have it in place today or only pieces, you may be scratching your head, where do you really stand, and really ask yourself the question, can you afford, not to go invest, and not particularly the real labor-intensive ones first would be the obvious choice. But so anyway, Art's going to take us through perhaps a typical case that you might run into as a company, and then I'll come back here at the end to finish it off. Art, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian. So here's a typical accounts payable story that we see for a customer. You have 12,000 active vendors. Number of transaction is fairly large. If you look at the FTEs there are 21, and so they're processing about 10 to 12,000 transactions per year, which is pretty standard. And a lot of country mix, multiple languages coming in the invoices. And the most interesting statistic, of course, is that they're PO based, so it's a manufacturing company in this case. Lots of line items that have to be reconciled, so that means that there's going to be a lot of matching and automation required into the matching. And they're distributed, 3 sites for invoice entry, distributed capture, and the invoices are coming in local currency. So the objectives are, we see this over and over. Error rate, Tapin, before it merged with IOFM, found that error rate was one of the highest rated objectives for any company 2 years ago, and it's still way up at the top, besides improving the cycle time. And then, of course, taking advantage of early payment discounts, depending on your cash strategy, if those make sense, and then the analytics, and to be able to achieve a streamlined process, always striving, for straight through to get to that magic number, whatever it is. And again, it's in the 70, 75, and sometimes 80%. And then, of course, better supplier interaction to improve the vendor relationships. And, of course, with a portal, you can reduce. We find that about 25% of the interaction with vendors is by phone. And that's about consuming the same amount of time. And you can mitigate a lot of that through a portal implementation. And then in the end, we hope, and in this case it is a fact, that we have a reduction where the FTEs can be reallocated, and they were in this case, moved into different roles in most cases. And the invoice cycle time was reduced. They weren't losing batches or invoices, and they didn't have a lot of off-cycle runs, which didn't line up with the standard schedules, and try to meet these KPIs. It's important to set up these KPIs realistically so that they can be measured as you're progressing through the process. Brian?
Thanks, Art. So one of the things after you look at the data and you've seen a couple of examples that articulate certainly the kinds of results that people get to, you start to ask yourself, all right, how do I go about this? And so particularly if you find yourself, gee, I could do more, I need to do more. And so, what we want to talk about now is perhaps, some options on how to get there. And so we want to show you some deployment methods. And if you just look at the bars on the left versus the bars on the right, the bars on the left are the on-demand software as a service. Think cloud in this perspective, and we go back. The first bar is at 2009. The last bar was 2016. But you can see, the interest or the deployment's actually more than doubled, moving to the cloud. Conversely, on the right, traditional licensed on-prem, has gone or dropped from 80 to 52. That doesn't mean that, everybody's 100% one way or 100% the other, but the point is that there's certainly been an increase in cloud adoption and versus, moving away from license on-prem. And there's some reasons behind that, which I'm going to go into. But in general, people find that, it gives me some options in terms of how I approach taking on more functionality. So we look at this slide and we say, why cloud? So, and I'll point out, the first 3 items don't have a thing to do with cost. They have to do with functionality and things I need to do to run my business. So think here in terms of, automation as an example. I've got to do those things. the end result may be improved, performance metrics, but it's not about the cost of the software. So being able to standardize in a single system across multiple entities, that's certainly one. The integration is much easier, and with cloud-based solutions because you get a standard when you do that. The need for a collaboration, amongst increasing number of locations. We mentioned that in terms of just the reporting itself, being able to roll up and roll down, across perhaps multiple systems, but being able to do that, easier, simpler, if you will, than manually adding those or getting feeds, summarizing spreadsheets. And, everybody's been through that. Everybody's seen examples of where that applies. Need an application that can scale with the business. This is another one where, you just get overwhelmed with big data. So if you don't automate a lot of these transaction processes, you're just going to get swamped. But again, I point out that the top three differentiators on why cloud are very functionally based. A lot of people think it's not that cost doesn't matter or that it's not important. The next one is must reduce IT costs. The one after that is capital funding too high. So they're certainly on the top 5 or 6 list. But again, the top three are about what I need to do to run my business. And I think there's been a real shift there, where it used to be that the cloud, the costs were the first thing, and the cost to implement, total cost of ownership are usually 1 and 2. Now it's moved more to I really need to improve my business. So I point that out. Data technology infrastructure, that's sort of underpinning the top three, if you will. It limits the organization's ability to respond to business more quickly. And again, if you recall, we talked a lot about, the speed of business and its increasing, velocity, if you will. I think Art's got a couple more points that he wants to bring up on the cloud, and then, I'll kind of wrap up here with the summary. Art, go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. I'd like to introduce you to one of our technologies called ReadSoft Online, but again, this is a cloud-based invoice processing solution. So I'd like to walk you through that to show you how this whole thing comes together. So the end customer scans their invoices on any type of a low-cost scanning device, and then these images are automatically transferred to the cloud. And from there, the key data elements from the invoice are then extracted. And for most of these invoices, this extracted data is passed over to the customer's ERP. And for those items that might need further review, the data in question can be provided back to the user as part of an exception handling process. And then for those companies who want to have a handoff process, the solution can do this exception processing as a service. In other words, most of these cloud-based solutions, because they're being shared, are really designed to have minimal customization. So, you try to get the design right in the beginning so that you can have minimal customization. However, in many cases, the customer has an exception, and depending on the architecture, these exceptions can be implemented and isolated so that does not impact the rest of the community. I think Salesforce.com is a poster child for this, where when you're writing exceptions in Salesforce.com, you're really working on a common foundation, and you're abstracting this interface for your own requirements. And here we have to have the same kind of capability. So the invoice is received, the data extraction is done, that's pretty standard. The exception and approval routing may be a little different for the customer, and then the mapping of the data back into the other system, if it's an ERP, can be done, and then the invoice image storage is going to be unique depending on the archive or whether they want to use the provided cloud storage. This product, this particular solution is bundled into Microsoft Nav, for example, as a bundled option that a user can subscribe to. And it's offered through the Microsoft Cloud through Azure. And then in terms of sophistication, just to show you that, you can get fairly sophisticated with these transactions. So here you have an invoice with a lot of line item detail. And these line items need to be checked for, the quantity and the price and all of that to make sure that they're validated prior to posting. So the solutions are really advancing. They're becoming more and more customizable in the sense that they can adapt. It's not as rigid as it used to be. However, keep in mind that there are trade-offs with all of these, especially through customization and not complying to, the standard behavior of the system. These are usually extra charges or extra coding that has to be implemented through services. So now we will go over to Brian to talk about some key findings in Aberdeen's research.
Thank you, Art. Just to quickly recap, a little bit of what we've covered today. Let's start with just what we've seen is that best-in-class companies have a significant performance advantage, as we articulated in terms of how we define the leaders. But then we look at, why they have those performance advantages. And again, the stories and the capabilities, and we saw that they've got a significant advantage, 2 and 3x, many times in terms of their likelihood to have those capabilities in place. And then, in addition to that, clearly the future is in automation, bots, and blockchain. And again, you can see the differences in terms of likelihood where best-in-class are investing their money and where they're headed. So it sort of points out that if you're not in that game, you certainly need to be thinking about it. Then just reviewing, what happens for companies that have automation versus those that don't, it's really not even close. And we took a straightforward financial close process, looking at journal entries, checklist execution and reporting, and again those numbers were significantly different. And then the days to close, 3 versus 8. I mean, who wouldn't like to have that? And think about the number of people engaged, that have to support a manual close, if you will. You've got 5 more days involved. So certainly just leveraging your people more effectively is a real key. The cloud presents an opportunity to address those technology gaps, and perhaps I didn't mention it, but involved in that is that you can eat the elephant one bite at a time. Gone are the days where you have to rip and replace everything. You can generally go after, the particular pieces that you need that can integrate with what you have, but certainly you don't have to go buy everything to get the one thing that may be holding you up. And this is a huge, huge advantage, particularly if you want to take on automation. Perhaps you go after the pieces, the ones that are the most painful first, the biggest time reducers, the most manual intensive processes. You go after those first before you get everything done at one time. But the point is, it does give you an opportunity to address the technology gaps. And then the leaders, clearly are streamlining their processes. Just the sheer amount of time is reduction, if you will, with the automation. That's how they get to it. So, recommendations: don't wait. Your competitors have already begun. So if you're waiting, you're hemming and hawing on a decision, it's costing you money. You're someone's ahead of you already. So think in terms of, take it as a call to action. The time is now. Prioritize the needs, the most painful perhaps first, most labor intensive first. Streamline your processes so that enables, automation to take place, eliminate the waste. I know these are fundamentals of any system, if you will. Then get the automation in place, improve the visibility and the reporting. Those are generally the biggest pain points when it comes to management, is being able to get the results in their hands quickly. And then I'd say follow the lead of the best-in-class companies. And here's the areas that they tackled first. Here's what they have in place. And then, have a continuous improvement mindset that, you're never done. And then I think that's probably the most underlying point that you can walk away with. So I'll leave you with that. I know we've got a lot of questions, and so I'll stop now and let me turn this back over to Bennett and let him moderate what we need to do on the Q&A side. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Brian. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of questions, so we're going to dive right into it. If we don't get to your question today, all your questions are being recorded, and we'll try to reach out to make sure we address everybody's question. So to start us off, Art, I have a question for you. We talked a lot about automation today, but can you talk a little bit about the level of productivity improvements that automation can achieve?
Sure. You know, first of all, you need to understand the fully burdened cost of the invoice processing, and you need to define that. And in some cases, you know, it can be $15 to $30 per invoice. We're talking about from the time it comes into the system to the time it's paid. This is a tough number to get, you know, but automation can impact up to 50 to 80% of this. And of course, the areas that are improved are going to be capture, transformation of the data, the matching for the PO invoices, expediting the approvals and payment. So all of that can be addressed. And I know Brian, when we were talking about this, had added that discount opportunities, you know, start picking up. That's a big statistic, isn't it, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, it's 84%, you know, versus 67. So when you just add to those the fundamentals that you brought out, just being able to take, you know, more discounts that you can get to versus the ones you couldn't, it's a big number, and that translates into, you know, bottom line results. So no doubt about it.
So Brian, keeping you going just a little bit, you talked a lot, and Aberdeen talks a lot about the best in class. What are some of the key enablers for attaining best in class in this space we're talking about?
Yeah, it's a bit of a loaded question, but let me pick maybe the highlights. You know, some of the more obvious ones that we pointed out in our slides. Electronic approval workflow. Again, this is tying the pieces together, and rather than chasing signature as an example, you know, the data or the approval workflow moves, you know, like email does, and it shows up in an inbox with a priority. So versus manually walking around getting things signed. So pretty fundamental. Electronic signature is the piece of that usually is, you know, you can get people out when they're out of town, so you can get those things signed and approved. You're not waiting on folks in and out of the office, that kind of thing. Automated remittance is another one. Again, this is down to the execution level, but literally just, okay, if 80% is straight-through processing, I think I heard Art mention that as one of the straight-through items, then you can remit that pretty quickly. So no longer, you know, manually cutting the checks, you know, have that done automatically. Full integration with ERP is another one. It's an enabler in the sense of it ties the pieces together, eliminates the manual handoffs. So envision it without the integration, you've got steps in between to rekey things, if you will, manually hand off. That adds to, you know, to the error rate, some, you know, rekeying on top of the rekeying. And so full integration is important there. Again, streamline it, automate it, and then having a central repository that everybody can access so that, you know, you're not chasing people on the phone with emails and trying to get your hands on the information that you need. Everybody can see that. Whoever has to pull the summary information together or look at a particular, you know, client, supplier, if you will, they've got the complete picture. So those are the big keys, I'd say, in the automation process, you know, certainly for AP and then maybe across the board on any of the financial processes. Hopefully that helps.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brian. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, everyone. I want to thank Brian and Art for sharing your research, insights, and recommendations with us, and thank you to our sponsor, Kofax, for making today's webinar possible. We hope you found today's broadcast to be beneficial. If you have any additional questions, you can submit them to our speakers. You can use the Q&A widget to do that. We did have a lot of questions just come in near the end. I'm sorry that we don't have time to address all of them, but they are being recorded. At the conclusion of the webinar, we have a short survey about today's event. We'd love to hear any feedback that you have, and we appreciate your time. If you're interested in more Aberdeen webinars, you can check out our resource page by clicking the teal A at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. There you'll find upcoming webinars as well as an archive of previous sessions with a wealth of Aberdeen research. Thank you very much for your participation, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.